So the next ones we're going to talk about are prolactin and oxytocin. And these are actually pretty different from each other. Prolactin is from the anterior pituitary, while oxytocin is from the posterior, but they're both involved in breastfeeding. So we're going to kind of put those together. The role of prolactin is actually to produce milk. And so we have prolactin coming in, binds to the milk glands. And in the milk glands, that's going to then stimulate the production of milk itself, so the fluid. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is involved in releasing the milk, or what we call the letdown reflex. And there we're going to see oxytocin coming in and binding to the muscles on the glands of the milk glands. And that's going to be able to squeeze those glands, and then milk will come out. So there's a big difference between the role of these two hormones. They're both going to require to have some stimulation in order to be released, and both of them can be stimulated by suckling, and oxytocin can also be stimulated during labor or orgasm. So when we talk about prolactin, prolactin has a little bit of a different control mechanism at the beginning than the ones we previously talked about. So first, let's just summarize that prolactin is going to stimulate the growth of mammary glands and stimulate milk production. So it's a peptide hormone. And as I said, it has a little bit of different regulation from the hypothalamus as what we'd normally been seeing. So normally we were seeing that hypothalamus releasing hormone A onto the pituitary, which then released hormone B. In this case, the hypothalamus hormone A actually blocks the pituitary. So when we release hormone A, we block the pituitary production of B, and then we don't make prolactin. So our normal pathway looks like this. First, in the hypothalamus, normally on a day-to-day basis, we're making dopamine. And dopamine is hormone A. Dopamine is actually inhibiting the pituitary. So we're going on our day-to-day thing, we're going on a picnic, we're going to Bi-Mart, whatever we're doing, we're not making milk. That dopamine, binding dopamine receptors in the pituitary, shuts those off. Now you don't make prolactin. However, if you block dopamine, then you release the pituitary to make prolactin. So here, if we got rid of our dopamine, now the pituitary can make all the prolactin that it wants. So here we're doing those double negatives, right? Dopamine is going to reduce prolactin levels, so blocking dopamine is going to increase prolactin levels. So we then have that pituitary release of prolactin, and that goes to that primary target tissue, which is going to be, in this case, the milk glands. And the milk glands are going to release. And normally we'd be saying they're releasing hormone C, but in this case, what we're saying they're releasing is the milk itself. So let's just call the baby the secondary target. So the way this is working is the hypothalamus is normally suppressing prolactin release. The only way to make prolactin is to block dopamine. So how do we block dopamine? Well, the ways that we can override dopamine are to have increased estrogens or to have mechanical stimulation of the nipple. And so a baby breastfeeding causes stimulation of the nipple. That then is going to block dopamine release in this region. That opens up the pituitary to release prolactin. So this is one to really kind of keep in mind, that this acts differently. And what great way to think about it is everything else we were trying to make happen regularly. And so we always wanted some growth hormone. We always wanted some cortisol. We always wanted some estrogen. In this case, you don't always want prolactin. So remember it that way, that you have to go through a special process to get prolactin made, because you generally don't want it there unless you're breastfeeding. So we can look here then, and instead of having negative feedback, we're having positive feedback from breastfeeding and nipple stimulation. Something that's just kind of interesting is that D2 agonists are actually used to block milk production. So if a woman gives birth and for some reason can't or doesn't want to breastfeed, then they can give a D2 agonist to quote unquote dry up their milk. The other hand of that is, what does a D2 antagonist do? A D2 antagonist is going to cause more prolactin release. So that's what we see when we look at antipsychotics, is we're seeing those are D2 antagonists. And so with olanzapine or haloperidol, you're seeing this D2 antagonism and the potential for increase of prolactin, which we were calling hyperprolactemia. Oxytocin, on the other hand, is that posterior pituitary hormone, and that's causing milk letdown, and it's also causing contraction of the uterus. So oxytocin is causing both of those things. It is also a peptide hormone, and it doesn't have any negative feedback. It requires stimulation in order to produce oxytocin. It's a very short pathway. It's basically just, here's the hypothalamus. It's directly releasing into the bloodstream because that's that posterior pituitary. You didn't need a second hormone there. So it's directly releasing into the bloodstream. That oxytocin is going, binding to the muscles on the outside of the milk glands, on the uterus, and binding to oxytocin receptors in the brain. And it's causing the muscles on the milk glands to contract, and that's causing letdown or causing expulsion of milk. It's also causing, when it's on the uterus, causes those muscles to contract and causes cramping, which is involved in labor and delivery, as oxytocin can help induce labor by increasing the contractions. And it can also be used after labor if there's excessive bleeding. By contracting down the muscles in the uterus, it can contract down those blood vessels and squish those and block uterine bleeding if there's excessive bleeding after birth. So how do we then get oxytocin to be released? We have to have a stimulatory factor, and that stimulatory factor are going to be generally mechanoreceptors on the nipple. There's also mechanoreceptors on the cervix and in the vagina. So we can see that that's involved in the release during labor, and it's also involved in release during orgasm. In both sexes, oxytocin is released upon orgasm. And then the receptors for oxytocin are going to be, as I said, around the milk glands, uterine muscle. It's on the ejaculatory organs in males and in neurons on both males and females that are involved in social bonding. And so people talk a lot about oxytocin release in a mother's brain while nursing a baby. There are other mechanisms for social bonding with babies that also produce oxytocin release. So dads can get it too. So we have some practice questions here. And as I said, I will put the keys for those up on Moodle. The last hormone we're going to talk about is antidiuretic hormone, which is also called vasopressin. And again, that's from the posterior pituitary. So we can skip one step, and we have one neuron that goes from the hypothalamus all the way down and releases ADH into the bloodstream. That goes to the kidney, where it's going to have multiple effects on osmolarity in the blood and in urine production. So the role of antidiuretic hormone is going to be to increase water conservation and to increase blood pressure. Now, you guys have already talked about this when you talked about renal as well as cardiovascular, so I'm not going to try to give you any more detail than you've already gotten. All I'm trying to do is just kind of give you a refresher on those basics. So antidiuretic hormone is going to be released when the hypothalamus sees a reduction in blood pressure or when it sees high blood salt concentration. And it's those hypothalamic neurons that are going straight down and releasing ADH into the bloodstream. That ADH is now going to arterioles, causing vasoconstriction, so that's increasing blood pressure, and it's going to the kidney and causing urinary retention. So that's decreasing fluid loss. Here you can see I just have water retention here in terms of decreased urine production. So I'm not going to have you memorize those receptors, but just to kind of let you guys remember that vasoconstriction happens through those V1s, and the antidiuretic through those V2 receptors. So on our diagram here, we just saw the hypothalamus making that ADH or vasopressin going directly to a primary target, kidneys or arterioles, which directly decrease urine production or cause vasoconstriction, and the decrease in urine production causes lower osmotic pressure in the blood, which comes back up and tells your hypothalamus that it doesn't need to release ADH anymore. So you've got kind of a basic negative feedback process there. So when we look at this, now that you've seen each of these individual pathways, hopefully when you then look at this chart, you can see how each of these really fits into that whole circuit, with something stimulating the hypothalamus to release hormone A, onto the pituitary, which releases hormone B, onto the primary target tissue, which releases hormone C, onto the secondary target tissue, which has the end physiological effect. That you have negative feedback in most cases because you want to be able to control that. A couple of cases where you don't have negative feedback, like prolactin and oxytocin, you don't need negative feedback because it takes something to make it happen to begin with. In this case, you have to continue to breastfeed in order to continue to make prolactin and oxytocin. So hopefully that helps you kind of wrap your head around those. And if you have any questions, as always, give me an email and we'll talk them through.